What's going on, guys? Today we have a very special video, a case that sits very closely to me due to its outright insanity and is very well known across the UK. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the case of Robert Maudsley, also known as Hannibal the Cannibal. Before we start, I have to warn you that there are some very graphic details, and what this man has done was truly demonic. So this one isn't for the faint-hearted. Before we get into today's video, if you're a fan of true crime, you're in luck because that's what we do all the time. So if that's what you're into, please like this video, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell because we upload every single day. Born on June the 26th, 1953 in Toxteth, a town near Liverpool, England, Robert Maudsley was the fourth of 12 children born to Coleman, George Maudsley and Jean, his wife. At a young age, Robert and 4 of his 11 siblings were placed in a Catholic orphanage, Nazareth House, after his parents decided that they were unable to take care of them. By all accounts, Robert enjoyed his time at the orphanage. He was well cared for and developed a close bond with his sibling. However, this all changed when Robert was just 8 years old and his parents decided that they needed the benefits that they would receive by having more children in their home. When he was picked up from the orphanage, Robert begged them to stay with the nuns, but he was taken back home and subjected to absolute hell. Robert's father, George, was a drunk, a drug addict, and all in all, a downright waste of space man. They were treated with disdain by their parents, who lacked affection. Neglect turned into outright abuse over time. Their father used belts, sticks, and even an air rifle to beat them. Little was done by their mother to step in. To put it bluntly, Jean wasn't much better, with more of an affection towards cocaine than her own children. Robert and his siblings were severely mistreated by their parents, with Robert regularly running away and seeking refuge from their rampages, with Robert actually later claiming that he had been raped as a child. The psychological scars left behind by this barrage of abuse served as the impetus for his later depravity. Robert was placed in foster care just a year after being reunited with his parents, being the only one of his siblings to be given up again. Robert moved to London when he was just 16 years old, running away from his foster parents. In order to support his new drug habit, Robert soon turned to sex work in London, and he had made several suicide attempts and claimed to have been hearing voices in his head who told him that he needed to kill his parents. By the age of 20, Robert was working on the streets of London selling sex for money in order to survive. On Wednesday the 13th of March 1974, Robert was picked up by a 30-year-old John Farrell. The pair initially went for a drink at the White Bear Inn near Piccadilly before getting the tube to John's Wood Green home. Once inside, Robert was instructed by his client to be quiet. The pair had sex and then went to sleep, with Robert waking up just after 8 AM, sleeping with John again and watching him as he went back to sleep. 2 hours later, at 10 AM, John woke up for a second time and then began making breakfast for the pair. Whether it was the thrill of paid sex or just the smell of bacon, something came over John and he began confessing to Robert about his sickening sexual past involving young boys. John brought out a suitcase and produced images of underage boys that he had raped. Robert, with his own childhood wounds, flew into a fit of rage, taking a knife and stabbing John in the chest. John fell back onto the bed and desperately tried to escape, but it was too late. Robert had seen red like never before, and there was no stopping him. John was stabbed, garroted, and then hit on the head with a hammer. After Robert had finished with his frenzied attack, he washed himself off and left the home, heading towards the local vicarage. Once he had arrived, he'd asked to speak with the vicar. When he was told the vicar was unavailable, he confessed to killing someone, but was told to come back in an hour when the vicar was free. Instead, he rang Wood Green police station and confessed to what he had done, telling them what they would find at the Wood Green home. Unbothered, John went back to his flat by Piccadilly line, changed out of his bloody clothes, and then went to see Cops and Robbers at the London Pavilion before handing himself in. Robert was declared unfit to stand for trial for the murder, and instead, at just 21 years old, he was sentenced to spend the remainder of his life in the infamous Broadmoor Hospital. Broadmoor is Britain's and arguably the world's most notorious criminal hospital. Originally called Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, the hospital has housed some of the world's most despicable criminals since its opening in 1863, such as Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, Ronnie Kray from the Kray Twins, David Copeland, the London Nail Bomber, Robert Napper, the Wimbledon Common Killer, and now Robert Maudsley, the guy that eats paedophiles. It was here that Robert would spend the next 3 years of his life, but instead of getting better, being surrounded by Britain's worst criminals was just a ticking time bomb, and by 1977, Robert, who was undoubtedly still carrying the scars from his own terrible history, could no longer stand to live next to sex offenders. On February 26, 1977, Robert and David Cheeseman, a fellow patient at Broadmoor, had been allowed to leave their single secure rooms for a football game. David Cheeseman was sent to Broadmoor in 1963 for intentionally injuring someone and receiving a 20-year restriction order. However, in 1974, David Cheeseman and his accomplice Roy Speake were found guilty of trying to kill a male nurse at Rampton Hospital by hitting them over the head with an iron bar.
I know what violence feels like because I've had extreme violence used on me. After I attacked the nurse in 1963, I had extreme violence used on me. Persistent violence, systematic.
Now you know a little bit about David's background. After the game, David got a male nurse to open the boot room so they could return their football boots, and Robert and David and another inmate, Francis, all entered. Once inside, Robert pulled the door shut and David secured it with a footlocker as the nurse tried to follow them inside. The nurse witnessed Francis being kicked in the stomach by Robert Maudsley while his wrists were bound and his field of vision was blocked. The pair tied 26-year-old Francis up with a flex from a record player holding him hostage. For the next 10 hours, Francis was tortured. Robert and David created an improvised weapon by splitting a spoon handle down the middle to form a crude pointed weapon. The DIY weapon was forced into Francis's ear, piercing his brain. When they drew the spoon out, bits of brain matter came along with it. This went on for hours until the pair eventually strangled him to death, with the wardens listening to his screams, unable to help.
On a Saturday morning, following a football match, we actually took Francis hostage, if you like, a hostage, but barricaded the door up, and over a 2 or 3 hour period, I assaulted him a few times, kicking him in the ribs and things like that. A couple of hours, or about 2 o'clock on the day, Francis said to me, he says, I know you're going to kill me, get it over with, And Bob said, I said, pass me the garrote. So we both strangled him there and then. He was tied up. We tied his hands to his face so he couldn't move.
After he was dead, the pair raised his body so that the hospital security personnel could view it through the door's peephole. After the murder, Robert was deemed competent to face trial. Despite killing a fellow inmate at Broadmoor, he was found guilty of manslaughter. He was taken to the notorious Monster Mansion, Wakefield Prison in West Yorkshire. Robert reportedly objected to the change and asked to go back to Broadmoor, but this request was turned down. David, on the other hand, later became a born-again Christian, remarried, and was moved to Hollesley Bay, an open prison where he was allowed on day release. In 2006, he was accused and acquitted of the rape of a 16-year-old girl. Since then, he appears to have changed his name and kept his nose clean. Once Robert Maudsley arrived at Wakefield Prison, he quickly found that his notoriety had preceded him. The other prisoners called him Hannibal the Cannibal and Brain Eater, and many of them avoided him because they thought he was unpredictable and insane. According to the rumours, Francis's body was discovered with his head split open like a boiled egg. It was said that Robert had eaten some of his brain after killing him, and that his head was found with a spoon in it, which is sort of true. He was widely regarded as a dangerous prisoner. Now we know that this was all a myth. cannibalism wasn't detected in Francis's autopsy. Robert's account of what happened was later corroborated by a jail guard. Robert had sharpened a plastic spoon and had used it to torture Francis by pushing it into his brain. Robert said that it was Francis's brains when a prison guard later inquired about what was on the spoon. The tale degenerated until Robert finally was labelled as a cannibal. At this point, Robert had started to gain media notice. Robert became known as Hannibal the Cannibal in the press. Despite the absence of proof and the police denial that it was true, the name still persisted. Later, the Press Complaints Commission intervened to inform the media that the rumours were baseless and that they should stop spreading it. Within weeks of entering HMP Wakefield, Robert started killing again. On July 28, 1978, Sawney Darwood, a 46-year-old man who was in prison for the murder of his wife, was invited to Robert's cell before being garroted and stabbed to death. He then patrolled the wing in search of further victims while concealing the body of Sawney under his bed. His attempts to entice other inmates into his cell were unsuccessful since they all resisted out of caution. They could see the lunacy in his eyes, one prisoner subsequently recalled. Bill Roberts, a 56-year-old paedophile and prisoner, was fatally stabbed after he had eventually lured him into his cell. Bill's skull was then split open by Robert with a homemade blade, where he proceeded to slam his head against the wall. He then calmly placed the homemade knife on the desk of the jail officer's guard room and told the guards that there will be 2 fewer names on the next roll call. Officers allegedly discovered a spoon sticking out of Bill's skull when they discovered his body. There was now also evidence that Robert had consumed some of Bill's brain. Robert was mysteriously returned to Wakefield prison, where he was transferred to solitary confinement because the governor refused to put him in the general population for protection of other prisoners. During his imprisonment, Robert spent time at Parkhurst on the Isle of Wight, where he met Dr. Bob Johnson, a psychiatrist who spent almost 3 years interviewing and counselling him. For just over 2.5 years, Dr. Johnson would share a cell with the serial killer, sitting close to the door, with Robert on the other end of the bed. Dr. Johnson warned him that if he frightened him, he wouldn't be able to help him because of the danger he was putting himself in. The two started dealing with Robert's childhood trauma, which Dr. Johnson thought was a major factor in his prosperity for violence. It was my responsibility as a doctor, Dr. Johnson said, to figure out how he became a serial killer. According to Dr. Johnson, Robert Maudsley was making remarkable strides and had already eliminated 75% of the hostility and later violence that made Robert such a risk. However, this treatment was abruptly stopped and Robert was transferred back to Wakefield without prior notice. Robert's brother Paul claims, as far as I can tell, the prison authorities are trying to break him. While incarcerated at Woodhill prison, he would get along very well with the staff and even play chess with them. Now he's currently back inside the cage at Wakefield. His problems began as a result of his early imprisonment. When they return him there, all it will accomplish is him to relive his ordeal. Robert Maudsley's violent outbursts caused him to mistake his victims for his parents, repeating the torture he had in their hands. According to a testimony given by the court in 1979 trial, his lawyer argued that the killings were a result of pent-up aggression resulting from many years of systematic abuse. Robert said, "When I kill, I think of my parents. If I had killed my parents in 1970, none of these people would have needed to die. If I had killed them, I would now be a free man going about my business without concern in the world." Authorities knew that Robert Maudsley was too dangerous to be around other convicts. It was decided in 1983 that Maudsley should continue to be housed alone. Plans were permitted to build a special unit since it was thought that he posed too great of a risk for the general populace. Because it resembles Hannibal Lecter's cell in the film Silence of the Lambs, the 2-cell unit in Wakefield Prison's basement was given the name Glass Cage by the prison administration. The cell was roughly 5.5 by 4.5 meters with wide bulletproof windows and only a table and chair made out of cardboard for furniture. With virtually complete seclusion, Robert spends 23 hours of the day locked up with his brick wall as an only view outside the tiny cell window. He's only permitted 1 hour of exercise each day, and during that time, 6 prison guards follow him back and forth from his cell. He's not permitted to speak to any other prisoners. He has allowed his fingernails to grow into claws and his hair to get long and wispy because no prison barber would enter his cell. Robert has long complained about his predicament. He has asked for the conditions of his incarceration to be loosened in 2000. He requested entertainment, personal care items, and also a pet budgie. If the jail administration refused, he informed the press that he would have preferred to be handed a cyanide pill so he could commit suicide. He said, "Why can't I have a budgie instead of flies, cockroaches, and spiders I currently have?" He later wrote to the Times, "I swear to cherish it and not consume it. If the prison service says no, then I will ask for a simple cyanide capsule which I shall willingly take, and the problem of Robert John Maudsley can be easily and swiftly resolved." As of today, Robert is currently approaching his 40th year of incarceration in his solitary confinement. Given the risk he poses to other inmates, the prison system maintains that there is no practical alternative. Whether or not the person is a serial killer, 40 years of solitude is likely to result in a significant decline in mental health.
Murray, who has on several occasions written letters saying that he is deeply concerned in respect of my speech, which has only been affected since my detention in solitary confinement. My speech has been affected. Mr. Hogan, a good friend of mine, finds it difficult to comprehend what I say.
Since Robert is known to have very high IQ, he doesn't have much to do in his cell by himself. You can't keep someone in solitary confinement for 25 years and expect them to have the same social skills as a typical human being. According to Robert's brother, it's obvious that the jail system only wants to keep Robert behind bars until he passes away. Robert appears to have given up on any chance of getting better. All I have to anticipate is a continued mental health collapse and potential suicide. In a lot of respects, I believe that this is what the authorities want. In this approach, the Robert John Maudsley issue can be quickly solved. Paul Harrison, a former police detective, recounts speaking with Robert. "You look like a monstrous creature, an awful nasty person. He has a reputation that the service has helped to maintain. I had a lot of preconceived notions. However, when we were actually talking, I could see why he did what he did. He was really smart, a witty man who made you grin if you saw him at a pub without knowing who he was or what he had done." A lot of serial killers are incredibly intense, narcissistic, and talk about themselves. He's the only man that made me truly think, wow, this guy is different to any of the other serial killers. The childhood experiences of Robert Maudsley set off a series of incidents that resulted in 4 killings. In his own words, Robert admits that there is a connection. If he had killed his parents in the 1970s, none of these individuals would have needed to die. Supporters of Robert contend that he is unfairly mistreated and kept hidden away so he can be forgotten. They contend that Robert's victims are sex offenders and people who murdered their wives were more deserving of the punishment than most. Robert had stated that only sex criminals are at risk of him. One can even contend that Robert's behaviour was an inevitable result of his upbringing. We must also keep in mind that many people who have experienced the same sort of things growing up go on to live honourable lives and avoid any hint of murderousness. Jane Heaton, who writes and visits Robert, said in the 2000s, "Since getting to know Rob, I have seen many prison documents about him. Everyone concentrates on the crimes he committed 25 years ago. It's like they're still living in the same time loop and no one is prepared to look at how he is now. I'd like to see him get an independent review of his condition and find a suitable cause for treatment for him." For some, the jury is still out on Robert Maudsley. Whilst he's definitely committed some absolutely horrific crimes over and over again, the people he targeted were morally ambiguous enough that some people do not believe that he deserves a lifetime of solitary confinement. Now, at the age of 68, apart from brief statements made to the media by his sibling, little is known about his current life. He still represents a threat to the public, according to his own admission, even though he maintains that it only applies to the worst members of society. Some people believe that living in solitary confinement for years on end is a fate worse than death. Robert's own wishes show that he feels the same way, and even if he had given the choice, he'd choose death. But the biggest question is, what's the alternative? What would you do when faced with a serial killer like Robert Maudsley? Well, that wraps up today's video. If you found that one interesting, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.